Welcome back. I'm Robert Breaker. We're continuing our verse-by-verse Bible study through the book of Acts, and we're going to do Acts chapter 25 today. I'm excited about this. There's not really much here in Acts 25 as far as doctrine goes. This chapter is pretty much completely historical, and there's a lot of history, and because of that, I'm going to give you a little history lesson here at the end of this about the different Caesars of Rome, and I hope that'll be a blessing to you as well. There are only 27 verses here in this chapter. Of course, there were 27 in the chapter before, and we went a couple minutes over. And usually I try to do an hour or less on each teaching. But today we're going to start Acts chapter 25. Acts chapter 25. And we're going to look at today, again, Paul being in jail. And remember that Paul is in jail. And reading in verse 27 of the chapter 24, it says he is bound. The last three words. He was left, Paul, bound. So Paul is left in jail for how long? For 2 years. So 2 years Paul loses of his ministry for what he did, but he's waiting here to see what happens. And this man, we looked at him last time, named Felix, was in charge. And so Felix was the governor, if you'll remember. He wasn't a black cat, although there was a black cat named Felix. Whenever I hear the name Felix, I always think of that black cat, Felix. But Felix was the governor of the area, if you'll remember. Well, in came another guy and took his place, and this guy's name is Festus. And that's who we're going to look at today. Festus, who is now going to be the new governor. And so Festus is going to be the man who takes over and the man who's in charge. And we're going to see what happens with Paul as they begin to talk about it. So let's begin Acts chapter 25. And here in verse 1. Now when Festus was coming to the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now who is Festus? Well, again, verse 27 of the last chapter says, and after 2 years, Porcius Festus, that's kind of funny, his nickname I guess was Porky. Oh, Porky Festus. Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. What does it mean that he came into his room? He took over his office. And he came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So he said, I'm going to leave this Paul guy to the next guy who comes in. Let him deal with it. So Felix left the whole thing about Paul to Porcius Festus and says, now he's your problem. So Festus shows up, takes over for Felix, and he's the new governor. Now what happens? Now when Festus was coming to the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So as soon as Festus became the governor, remember they're in Caesarea at the time, then after 3 days he goes down to Jerusalem. Now in verse 2, what does it say? Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him. So he goes down to see the Jews. Remember, this is the province of Judea, I believe. And so it's all included, the city of Caesarea, Antipatris, or however you say it, in Jerusalem. So all this he's the governor of. And so he goes down there, and the first thing he comes across is the high priest and the chief of the Jews coming together and say, hey, so what about Paul? What about Paul? What are you going to do with Paul? They haven't forgotten Paul. They want to kill Paul. And they say, now we got a chance. Why this other guy wouldn't kill Paul first, maybe this guy will. So they come to him, and it says here, then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him. Verse 3. And desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, lying wait in the way to kill him. So what were the Jews doing? They were saying, informing him against Paul, saying, hey, we don't like Paul. And beseeching him. They besought him. Beseech is to beg. They're begging him, please bring Paul to Jerusalem. We want to see him. Why? Well, you could just bring him down here. And what were they thinking? Well, the Bible says in verse 3, and when he comes down, we're going to kill him. Now, who's going to kill him? Remember, we looked at last time that there were 40 men that were of the Jews that said, we're going to bind ourselves to an oath that we won't eat or drink until we kill Paul. Well, here we are 2 years later. 2 years and 3 days later. You think those guys are still alive? Well, I think they probably starved to death like myself. But he says, please. So they must have other men that are willing to kill him. So they ask him, please bring him on down here. Well, I think Festus knew better. I think Festus said, no, Felix gave me the scoop on this, and you guys wanted to kill him. No, I don't think so. So what does he say? Verse 4, but Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. So Festus looks at the Jews and he says, no, I'm not going to send this guy Paul back to you. All right, you guys have tried to rip him in pieces. You smote him on the face. You beat him. You hate this guy. You made false accusations against him. It's obvious to me that you want him dead for some reason or another. No, I'm not going to give him to you. So Paul is kept there. And he says here, now, when I go back shortly thither, all right, so Festus is speaking, verse 4, and it says, but Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Now, what does shortly mean? Well, we look down at verse 6, and it says, and when he had tarried among them more than 10 days. What is more than 10 days? 11 days. So he spent 11 days down there. And I'm sure for those 11 days, the Jews kept pestering him. Come on, just send Paul down here just for a minute. Oh, we just want to talk to him. Oh, come on. But 11 days, that's how short of a time that he stayed. That's a short trip for some people. I mean, for some people, that's a vacation. 11 days. But he said he would depart shortly thither. And he did. He left. So he stayed there shortly, and then he left. Now, verse 5. Before he goes, Festus tells the Jews, let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me. Now, why does he say go down? We've looked at it before. On a map, it's going up to where he's going, but in the topography, he's in Jerusalem, which is up on a hill, and he has to go back down to, Caesarea, where he's going. So he says, they that which are able, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. So here he tells them, look, Jews, why don't you just come with me? And then you come down here and you tell me what's wrong with this guy. So what are they doing again? Well, double jeopardy. I mean, he's already been accused by the lawyer Tertullus. Now, the new governor's going, hey, why don't you make another accusation? So, like trying to try the guy twice, you know. Of course, he still hasn't had a legal trial. So far, he's just been given the opportunity twice to stand before his accusers. And what did Paul say? I've done nothing wrong. Twice. And yet, he's still not free. He's in jail. Although he's free enough to have whoever he wants to come visit whenever they want to come. So we continue here in verse 6. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, so at least 11 days, he went down into Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. So this would be, I guess, since it's the next day, 12th day. And he's been gone for 3 days, so this is about 2 weeks later. So about 2 weeks after Festus takes over as the new governor of Judea, he says, now I'm going to finally get a hold of this Paul guy and figure out what's going on. So he gave it a good 2 weeks. That's faster than a lot of politicians today. So that's pretty good. So he's commanded Paul to be brought into the judgment seat. So Festus returns and the next day calls for Paul. Now, verse 7, and when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Notice what the Bible says. These Jews came down from Jerusalem. Now, how long did it take them? Well, we know that you could get to Antipatris, or I'll just call it Antipatris. That's the way I look at it. That you could get there overnight, because you remember Paul made a journey overnight. So it takes all of night, so what, maybe 12 hours, maybe 8 hours to get there. And then beyond that is Caesarea. So it definitely can be done within a day's trip. And so when they came down, so they probably came down that same day or day after. And when they came down, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So they're not giving crimes. They're not saying this man did this against the law, and they're just complaining. Oh, and we don't like him because he did this and that and the other. And so they're just a bunch of complainers. And they complained. But all their complaints could not be proved. And isn't that what law is supposed to be about? You're innocent until proven guilty. When I was a kid, I was taught in school. I remember sitting in class when the teacher was telling us about how great America is because of our court system. Because in America, you're innocent until proven guilty. And that's when I was 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. Now I'm 40-something years old. And nowadays, you're guilty until proven innocent. I mean, everything has changed and everything, it's just, and Paul's in the same system. He's in a system where he's guilty and he has to prove himself innocent because they're holding him for 2 years against his will and he hasn't done anything. And the people that are accusing him of doing something cannot prove it. So this is an abuse of power. This is a corrupt court. It's what we'd call a kangaroo court, if you will. This is the exact same thing that Jesus had to go through. He was led about from court to court. So you got all this taking place, and what happens is they come and they give all these complaints against Paul that they can't prove. So no evidence. So could you imagine going to a judge and saying, we want you to put this guy in jail and put him on trial for, and the judge says, yes. The judge says, no, you got to charge a man with a crime. What do you tell me? There's no evidence to I mean, any righteous judge would say, well, throw this out of court. There's no evidence whatsoever to support any accusation. But they continue. Verse 8. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended anything at all. So Paul gets to speak for himself. And in this chapter, Paul doesn't get to say much. So this chapter is mostly history about what's going on behind the scenes. Now the chapter before was it verse 10 to verse 21 that Paul spoke. Paul begins speaking in chapter 24 and verse 10, and he speaks all the way down to verse 21. So he gets 11 verses to speak before, 2 years ago. Now it's 2 years later, and they give Paul one sentence. And his answer is, I've done nothing against the law of Israel, the law of Moses. I've done nothing against the temple, and I've done nothing against Caesar. So I've not broken Mosaic law, I've broken Roman law, and I have not broken any sort of religious custom or anything, and I'm not a religious bigot. So I've not broken the law of my nation. I haven't sinned nationally against the law of my nation. I haven't been sanctimonious and religiously did something evil against my people. And secularly, I've done nothing wrong. So Paul says, I'm threefold innocent. I'm innocent of any crime against the law that they say. I'm innocent of any crime of what these religious, lost religious leaders say that I might or might not have done. And I am free, and I know that I have not offended in anything Caesar, Rome. So let me read him again. Paul says in verse 8, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. Paul continues to say, I am innocent. I offended no one. Now you think, if Festus was a good guy, he'd be like, all right, you're free to go. No, it appears that he wants to keep him there for money. Because that's why this guy, Felix, kept him. He was hoping that the Jews would pay money. And if they paid him enough money, why, he'd just give them to the Jews, let them kill him. It doesn't sound like they care about truth and justice. They just care about what makes me rich. And unfortunately, that's what happens today. Many lawyers today don't care about truth and justice. They care about, okay, what will make me the richest the quickest? And that's kind of sad. It should be about justice. So verse 9, Festus speaks. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judge of these things before me? So he says, well, Paul, would you want to go back there and talk to them again? And Paul's thinking in the back of his mind, that didn't work out too well for me 2 years ago. They were literally trying to rip me to pieces. And I heard that they're trying to kill me. And there was 40 guys that tried. No, I don't think so. Thanks, but no thanks. We've done that already. We've been down that road. No thanks. So Festus asked Paul, will you go ahead and go to Jerusalem? And he's like, I don't think so. So that's not an option. So verse 10, then said Paul. So Paul says, look, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. He says, no, I'm not going back to Jerusalem, to a place where they want to kill me. I'm safe here where I am, under your custody. I'm a Roman citizen, and Rome is supposed to be protecting me, although they're not giving me the right to a speedy trial. So no, I'm not going to go to the Jews. I'm not going to allow them to try to kill me. I come before you and I say, help. Now, there's actually another verse here where he speaks. So I said earlier, Paul only gets one verse in this chapter. I was wrong. He gets a couple of verses to speak in this chapter. And I want to make sure I say that correctly. So then in verse 10, Paul says, then says Paul, I I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. Now verse 11, Paul says this, for if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things wherewith they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Now hold on a second. Paul starts out and he goes, I've committed nothing wrong. He says, I haven't offended no one. I haven't sinned against them or anybody. He says, but if I've done something worthy of death. Whoa, hold on a minute, Paul. Who's talking about death? They have nothing to accuse you of, but yet they're demanding that you die. Paul says, look, if I have done some sort of capital punishment, I don't refuse to die. Paul is telling us, I believe in capital punishment. That means Paul is not a Democrat or a Republican. In the United States of America, we used to have capital punishment. There used to be laws that governed, and if you did a certain crime, the penalty was death. For example, if you murdered a man in cold blood, you were to be murdered. In the Old West, if you stole a horse, you were to be hanged upon a trial by jury. If you raped a woman, if you murdered, if you were found doing buggery, I won't even say what buggery is, people might know, they might not, there was the death penalty for these certain things. And in America, we used to have the death penalty. Now we don't. All these liberals came in and said, oh, it's so cruel, it's just so cruel to kill somebody. No, it's not. The Bible says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So especially when it comes to murder, if you murdered someone in cold blood, or many someones, let's say you're a multiple murderer, you've killed 5, 10, 15, why do we have to pay taxes for you to live? I don't understand these judgments where the judge says, well, life in prison, or double life, or triple life in prison. And I go, all right, let me get my calculator. I'm not that good at math, but how much does it cost for this person to live in that prison? And it's something like $200,000, $300,000 over 30, 40 years that we pay for that person to live. And I look at that and I go, why should I pay for him to live when he's a murderer and he should die, the Bible says. Capital punishment. See, God's not against capital punishment. Paul says, look, if I've done anything worthy of death, then kill me. He says, I refuse not to die. I believe in capital punishment. The Old Testament law, there was capital punishment. So I don't understand how today in America they've gotten rid of the death penalty. Because why are we paying taxes for, it doesn't make sense. If I wanted to, and God forbid I would never want to, I could go out and kill 20 people. And then know, you know what, they'll never touch me. Oh, sure, they'll put me in jail for the rest of my life, but I get a cot, I get a TV, I get food, 3 meals. Why should I work a job slaving away for the man to pay taxes? I might as well just go kill somebody, then I'm set up for life in the Hotel San Quentin. That's the thinking of criminals. Criminals think today, if I do wrong, so what? What's the worst that can happen? 3 meals a day and a bed? Woohoo! When the law used to be, if you murder somebody, you will be hanged, you will be put in the electric chair, you will be shot, you die for that. Now, I wouldn't want to be shot, so I don't want to kill anybody because I don't want to be killed. But if the penalty for murder is just a couple of years in jail, well then what the heck, I might as well. That's how criminals think, and that's wrong. So we had the death penalty in America, and rightly so, and now it's gone. And that's why I think there's so much crime in the world, is because people think, well, I can do such and such and get away with it. I've known people that murdered someone and went to jail supposedly for life, and they were let go after 20, 30 years. Now they're living the rest of their life, and they're murderers. And what does the Bible say? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If someone murders someone else in cold blood, they shouldn't live. Because that person's a murderer, and they might do it again. And I've read stories of people that murdered someone, got out of jail after 10, 15, 20 years, murdered somebody else, went back to jail. And I'm sitting here scratching my head going, why? If you would put them to death like the Bible says, they wouldn't kill those other people. What a travesty of justice. What a sad, sad thing. So here the Apostle Paul tells us, look, I am not against the death penalty. And we that are Christians, we should feel the same way. I'm not against the death penalty. If someone has been found guilty of murder, especially double homicide or triple homicide, and the evidence proves it beyond shadow of a doubt, why should we pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for that person to live out their life and die in jail? Let's put them to death as the Bible commands. Eye for an eye, teeth. You say that's Old Testament. Yes, but we're reading the New Testament. And our apostle, Paul, says in the New Testament, look, I'm in favor of the death penalty. If I did something worthy of death, I deserve to die. I refuse not to die, he says. So, there should be such a thing as a death penalty today. Unfortunately, we live in a society there's not, and it's sad. So Paul says, I appeal unto Caesar. Now, verse 12. Then Festus, when he conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. So basically, this guy Festus listens, and he says, Paul, what do you... Paul says, look, twice he says Caesar. He says, I appeal unto Caesar. And then in verse 10 he says, I stand at Caesar's judgment, to where I ought to be judged. So he says, take me to Caesar. And so what does Festus say? Kind of scratches his head and goes, well, okay. If you want to go to Caesar, then I'll take you to Caesar. And here in a little bit, I'm going to show you who the Caesar was at that time. One of the worst Caesars that ever lived, and one of them that was the worst to Christians. I mean, he slaughtered and killed Christians. But Paul is literally saying, I feel more safe going to a lost, wicked court system than I do going to the lost religious people and the false religion of the Jews. Because they want to kill me. And yes, this Roman law is corrupt, but I feel like I might get a better, fair trial with them than I would with those guys. Because they already said they want to kill me. So that's Paul's understanding and his mindset at the time. So he says, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. Now verse 13. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Bernice. I guess that would be his wife. I haven't looked that up. I think that's who Bernice is. I should have looked that up. But King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. And I'll continue reading here in a second. But to notice what it says there. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came. Who is King Agrippa? Well, let me try to draw this out here. And again, I'm not the best when it comes to maps. So I'm going to cut down the map here a little bit. Here we have Nazareth, where Jesus was born. Jesus of Nazareth. You know, we talked about how they called Paul a Nazarene and things like that. This right here would be the Sea of Galilee. This over here. See if that shows up over there. Now up here on the coast we have Tyre and Sidon. So this is the city of Tyre. This is the city of Sidon. Now here, up here around this area is Caesarea Philippi. Now remember, we looked at Jerusalem would be down here someplace. It would be Jerusalem. And how Paul went up to Antipatris and then went up farther to Caesarea or whatever. So somewhere, I don't know if it was this Caesarea. There's so many Caesareas it's hard to keep up. There's Caesarea Philippi and all this stuff. But I'm drawing this map not to show you where Paul is now. I'm drawing this map to show you where this guy, Herod, comes from and why he's called a king. There's a town here, right here, called Abila. Up here there's a city called Heliopolis. So they're down around here. Here's Jerusalem. And so somewhere around this area is where Paul is bound. And there comes a guy named King Agrippa. Why is he called a king? What's so great about this Agrippa guy that he's called a king? Who is King Agrippa? Who is that guy? So I look it up, and I've enjoyed looking this up online and finding out more about these people in the Bible. But King Agrippa was one of the Herods. Okay, there were several Herods. This would be Herod Agrippa, and he's called the king in the Bible. And he had, the Herod before him, had the title as the king of the kingdom of Chalcis. And this Herod died in 48 AD. And in 53 AD, Herod Agrippa gave up Chalcis in exchange to something. But the Emperor Claudius made him king over Batanea, Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, and Lysanias in Abila. So you've got You've got all of Judea, I guess would be all of this around here, would be Judea. So you've got all these different provinces of Rome. And it'd be like different states for today. And this state was the state in which Herod was the king over. So he was the king of this area. And for some reason, God only knows why, the Caesar granted unto him the title of king. So he called himself King Agrippa. Now, go back to Acts chapter 9 and verse 15. When Paul gets saved in Acts chapter 9, as soon as he gets saved, God says something to him. Acts chapter 9 and verse 15. Acts 9:15, but the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. God in His infinite wisdom knew that Paul would go to and preach to kings. And here we see Paul preaching to a Gentile king, King Agrippa. So that's back there, all the way back in prophecy of what's to come in Acts chapter 9. Here the prophecy is fulfilled. He's preaching to a king, King Agrippa. I find that quite interesting. I don't find that very often in different commentaries. It's funny what they leave out in commentaries, but you find if you just read the Bible. Now, back to Acts 25 and verse 13. And after certain days, King Agrippa came unto Caesarea. So King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to suit. So was it this Caesarea of Philippi, or was it a different one? That I told you before, there's several cities named Caesarea. So this king comes down to visit Festus, to visit with him. So verse 14, and when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. So Festus tells Agrippa all about Paul. Now, what's taking place here in this chapter is taking place about 62 AD. And this is very important for later. But so you'll know the time period that this is taking place. I believe this is around 62 AD. And so Herod comes down and says, Hey Festus, how you doing? What's going on? And Festus goes, Well, let me tell you this story about this guy named Paul. He's been down here in jail in bonds for 2 years, and I don't even know what to do with the guy. And so verse 15, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. So the Jews hate this guy, and they want him dead. And they want me to kill him. But it's a peculiar case, because he's not just a Jew, he's actually a Roman citizen. So I'm kind of in a pickle here, Herod. What would you do? What do you think I should do here? And then Festus continues, verse 16, to whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. So Festus says the Jews were making accusations, but they still haven't given him any crime. So verse 17, Therefore when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. 18, Against whom, when the accuser stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. So he's saying, look, they were telling me this guy's evil, he ought to die, he ought to die. So when I had them come over and talk to me, and they made their accusations, I'm like, I don't see anything here worthy of death. There's something going on here. What's wrong with these Jews? They're making their accusations, but they're not, to me, it sounds like they're weak accusations and not powerful enough to try to put somebody to death. So verse 19, But had certain questions against him and of their superstition, and of Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed was to be alive. So he says they're talking about some guy named Jesus who was dead, but Paul says he's alive. Now that's interesting. So he calls the Jews superstitious. I find that interesting because Paul, remember back in Acts, what was the chapter where he went to Athens? Paul, back in that chapter, he says, no, it's the Greeks that are superstitious, because they have all these different gods and all these different superstitions. So anyway, verse 20. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. So he says, look, I asked Paul, you want to go to Jerusalem and be judged? Now what does Paul say in verse 21? But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. So he says, hey Paul, you want to go down to Jerusalem and let the Jews judge you? And Paul was like, no, I'll stay right here where it's safe, thank you very much. If anybody's going to judge me, it's going to be you guys, because I want to be under your protection. I don't want them to kill me, because that's their plan, to kill him. So when Paul, verse 21, had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Now look at verse 21. Augustus. All right? The word Augustus. And here Festus is speaking, and he says, Festus says, I need to give him and reserve him to the hearing of Augustus. So another man is mentioned, and this is Augustus. Now here, you have some people that love to try to find errors and mistakes in the King James Bible. And so they'll run to this and say, oh, the King James Bible is so full of errors and mistakes. Why, what a bunch of fools. People that believe in the King James Bible. There's so many historic inaccuracies. Why, those idiots. Actually, no. No, there's none. There are no historic inaccuracies in the King James Bible if you'll study the Bible and you'll study history. Augustus was mentioned here. That is correct. Augustus Caesar lived about 63 before Christ to about 14 AD. So people say, well, this is written about 62 AD. Well, guess what? That's about 50 years off. 48 years off. So, the King James Bible, the men that wrote the Bible didn't even know who the Caesar was, didn't even know what they're talking about. No, they did. It is a historically accurate record. Why did he say this? But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Okay? This man, Augustus, was the Caesar from 63 to 14 AD. This, what we're reading, is taking place about 62 AD, so Augustus has been dead about 48, 50 years, somewhere around there. But when you look at history, you find an interesting thing. Augustus was the beginning of a new epic of Rome. He was the beginning of a new line of Caesars. So this would be the Augustan line of the Caesars. So when they're saying that he will be reserved to the hearing of Augustus, he's saying, I'm going to send him to the Augustus line of Caesars. So what happened? Well, this guy named Augustus, his name was Gaius Octavius Caiapius. Some people say his name was Gaius Octavius Thurinus. But he was the first emperor of the Roman Empire. He's the founder of the Roman Principate. He started the Pax Romana. Julius Caesar was killed in about 44 AD. He was assassinated. He left power to Augustus in his will. Augustus was Caesar's grandnephew. And for some reason Caesar liked him, so in his will he says, if I die, then power should go to this guy. So Augustus was the first of the new Roman dynasty of rulers of Rome. And so this would be called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And so it's not wrong for the man Festus, who was from Rome, to look at whoever comes after him as coming from him. For he is the first Caesar. He is the beginning of that rule. It's like you look at history and you look at England. I love to study the England kings and queens. And you've got the Hanover line and the Stuarts and the different lines. Well, you got King George. What were those called? Was that the Hanover line, the Georges? Well, you had George 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, you would say, well, send him over to the court of George. Which one? The first one or the fifth one? So there's nothing wrong with the King James Bible saying he needs to be reserved to the hearing of Augustus, because Augustus was the title or the name of the Caesars that they came from. Kind of like the kings, the different kinds of kings. You've got the Stuart lines of kings, and then you've got I can't even remember what the other line was, but you've got these different lines. So I don't see an error here in the King James Bible. I see here the Romans, because this is a Roman speaking, saying that we count the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5 Caesars that come after him as all pointing to him, for he is the new line of emperors of Rome. So send them to Augustus. What does that mean? Send them to the Augustus court. Send them to the Augustus way of governing. Send them into Augustus, because a new thing had happened. Now, what I thought I would do up here is give you a little bit of a history lesson, because I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to show you up here all the different emperors of Rome. And the actual empire itself, because before Rome was a republic, the Roman Empire and the Roman emperors, we still emperor, I spelled emperors wrong, so I'll just put up here the Roman Empire and Caesars. I'll just call them the Caesars. And they still call them Caesars, okay? And there were quite a lot of them. So let's put their name here. And I want to put them up here just so you know who they are, because to me this is interesting. I'm going to put up here when they lived, and I'm going to put up here when they reigned. And I like this because this helps me as I study my Bible to understand who I'm talking about. So the first guy to set up the Roman Empire as an empire, and no longer a republic, and set up the Pax Romana and set up a new system of governing in the Roman Empire is Augustus. And so they look at the followers of Augustus as coming from Augustus. So they call that the Augustus. Augustus lives from 63 to 14 AD. So he lived 63 BC to 14 AD. He reigned 27 to 14 AD. 27 BC to 14 AD. So Augustus died in 14 BC. So people say, so see, the King James Bible doesn't know what he's talking about because he wasn't even alive. Yes, but those that came after him are from the Augustan line. And the court that he's sending it to would be the court that was instituted by Augustus. So he's sending him to the Augustus court. So the next guy to come along was this guy, Tiberius. Now this is interesting. He lived 14 BC to 37 AD. He reigned 14 AD to 37 AD. And this guy Tiberius, he came after, as did two more guys, and then a guy named Nero. And this would be what they call the Julio-Claudian dynasty. After Tiberius came Caligula. Ooh, a bloody evil man, Caligula. Then came Claudius, and then came Nero. So Caligula was 12 AD to 41 AD that he lived. This is when he lived. Claudius lived 10 BC to 54 AD. Nero lived 37 AD to 68 AD. So the person that would have been the Caesar at this time, because we're reading of something that happened around 62 AD, would have been this guy, Nero. So Nero was the one that Paul is saying, I appeal to Caesar. Do you know who Nero was? He was evil. Why, Nero was awful. Nero burned down Rome, and he supposedly played his fiddle. Of course, I don't think they had fiddles back then, but I'm not sure. But he supposedly played his fiddle as Rome burned. And after Rome burned down, he blamed the Christians, and he killed a bunch of Christians. So he's a murderer, and he's a hedonist. And if you believe all the stories, you know, he did evil things like commit sexual incest with his sister or mother or something. I can't remember all the evil things that this Nero guy is remembered for. But Nero was just pure evil incarnate. Nero was a bad guy. And when did he reign? Why, Nero reigned from about 54 to 68 AD. And let me write up here real quick. Claudius was about 10 BC. About 41 BC, AD to about 54. And Caligula was about 37 to 41. And if you look at this, you go, man, they sure don't reign very long, these emperors. Why do these Caesars not last too long? Well, there's so much corruption and political intrigue. Many of them are poisoned or stabbed to death or die in war. And so there's a lot of assassinations going on. So this would have been the guy, Nero, who was the king at the time, or the emperor at the time, and he was from the lineage of Augustus. So when the Bible says he needs to appear before Augustus, what are they saying? He's going before the Augustus lineage, or the Augustan dynasty. So the Bible's not an error mistake. They would have known that. They would have known who we were talking about. Let's go to after this, and I thought I'd go ahead and just put down some more of these guys. You might know some of these, you might not. But who was the emperor after Nero? A guy named Galba, who was from 3 BC to 69 AD. And he ruled from 68 to 69. He only ruled 7 months. Now this is where Rome gets interesting. After Nero, who came into power by assassinating the guy before him, some say his mother did it to put him in power. People looked at that and said, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And the next couple of emperors, well, they don't last very long. They're all killed or commit suicide. After Galba, the Emperor Galba, the Caesar Galba, comes Otho. He lived from 32 AD to 69 AD. And he reigned from 69 AD to 69 AD. He only reigned about 3 months before he got his. So you don't have these guys staying in power long, because Rome was always political intrigue and I'm going to kill you. No, I'm going to kill you first. Well, I got you. Oh, I'm in power because I killed that guy. It's filthy. It's wicked. It's politics at its worst. Next comes Vitellius. And he reigns for 8 months. And he reigns towards the end of 69 AD. So he reigns in 69 AD, only around 8 months. Then comes a guy named Vespasian. Now, I like this guy. I mean, I don't like him, but I recognize this guy. He lived from about 9 AD to 79 AD. And I recognize him because years ago on eBay, they were selling these old Roman coins that they had found. And they were all just compacted together, and they'd pull out a little lump, and you could buy this lump of coins, and then you would sit them in lemon oil for a day, then take them out, put them in olive oil for a day, and then back to the lemon oil, and you go back and forth. And it took me probably a month and a half until I was able to get these coins clean enough. And many of them I couldn't even read, but a couple of them, one of them was really cool because it wasn't flat. It was kind of like a cone. Not a cone, but kind of a rounded cone type coin. But one of the coins was a Vespasian bronze coin, and it was this guy. So that was kind of cool. I feel a connection sort of to him because I have a coin in my collection that has this guy on it. So that's kind of cool, and that would have been just after the time of Paul. How cool is that? Well, after Vespasian was Titus. And this is Titus, who was the son of Vespasian. He was born 39 AD and died in 81 AD. He reigned from 79 to 81. Then we have Domitian, who came after Titus. So Titus didn't reign very long, about 2 years. And so the next guy, he was born in 51 AD, and 96 AD he died, 81 to 96 AD. So we read that the book of Revelation was written about 90 to 95 AD. So this would have been the last Roman emperor that lived in which we still had an apostle that was alive. And that live apostle was the Apostle John. And he would have been writing his book of Revelation while this guy was alive. And it would have been this guy, Domitian, who would have put him in exile out here on the island of Patmos. So this is the next dynasty. This was the next dynasty. And this is known as the Flavian dynasty. Oh boy. Don't you love history? Well, I do. I love history. I don't know why. And what's so amazing to me is how we can look back here 2,000 years ago and say, this is awesome. Because we have a Bible that's written during these times. So it's amazing that we still have records to prove that the Bible is true. And everything the Bible is saying, we can look back in historical records and go, yeah, that was during the time of this guy and this guy. Don't give me this garbage that man wrote the Bible, that book's no true. It is a historical book, and it is a prophetical book. And it gives past history and future history. And so I find it amazing. Now, after this, after the Flavian, I wrote Flavian history. While I was thinking history. I meant to write dynasty. The Flavian dynasty. After the Flavian dynasty comes the Nerva. They call this the Nerva Antonine dynasty. So you've got all the, see how the different Roman empires, they're a different dynasty? So when the Bible says here in chapter 25 and verse 21 But when Paul had appealed to be reserved under the hearing of Augustus, he's saying, I want to be under the Augustinian or the Augustus dynasty. I want to be ruled at that, and Nero is a part of that. So I don't see this as an error or a mistake in the King James Bible. Now, very quickly, let me just go ahead and write up here these guys. I won't even give when they reigned or when they lived, but they were all from 96 to 192 AD. So until almost 200 years after Jesus. And it's amazing how good our records are that we have from about 2,000 years ago, that we can remember these guys to the day. You know, a lot of them we know to the day when they ruled. But Nerva took over after Domitian. Then a guy named Trajan. Then a guy that you might know named Hadrian. And Hadrian is awesome. You know, I don't like any of these guys. They're all lost. They're all worshippers of false gods. They're all evil. Many of them persecuted Christians. But I have a little connection of Hadrian because I went to a... well, first of all, the Hadrian Wall. If you know what the Hadrian Wall is, you would know Hadrian built the Hadrian Wall there in England, or the United Kingdom, between Scotland and down, because he said, those Picts, man, they're crazy. We can't conquer them. Let's just build a wall. And to this day, you can go over to England and still see the Hadrian Wall. But I think Hadrian is interesting because one time I went to a coin show, and I'm just walking around, and this guy had a bunch of denarius, silver denarius, and one of them was a Hadrian. And so it was a little about 1/10 of an ounce silver coin, and it was Hadrian. It was about 90 to 100 after Jesus. And I bought that, and I've got that coin in my collection. I think it's so neat to look at this. This is so, and I only bought it because it was a denarius. And a denarius was about a day's wage in those days. A denarius was about 1/10 of an ounce of silver. And you work all day long, and about the minimum wage was 1 denarius per day for work. So I just always thought that was really cool, you know. It's about the size of a dime today. If only a dime was worth what it's supposed to be worth, man, life would be way easier. But anyway, from 2,000 years ago, we have quite a different, because today that 1/10 of an ounce of silver is worth about $2. So we have inflation, and in the old days $2 would have gone a long ways, but now $2, we look at that as like, well, you can't even get a hamburger. Yeah. Quite a lot of inflation. So after Hadrian was Antonius Pius, then Lucius, Verus. Let's see if we're still able to see him. Almost off the screen. The next guy you probably know, and you've probably heard of him, Marcus Aurelius. And maybe you have, maybe you haven't. A lot of these guys have left their mark, and you go to Europe and you'll find things that they put up. Next guy was Commodius. I don't even have room to put him in here. It'll probably come off, so I'll put him up here, Commodius. And I think I have one of those coins that I got from eBay that I cleaned up, was a Commodius coin from about 180 after Jesus. So Marcus Aurelius you've probably heard of. Why? Well, he's got this huge column which commemorates his defeat of the Germans, and how Marcus Aurelius defeated a lot of the Germans, because the Germanic Empire was coming against Rome, and eventually was their downfall. You know, the Visigoths and all that, the Huns. So I find it amazing. I enjoy studying history. So I said, well, today we're going to have a history lesson. So as we study this, it's quite interesting. Look at this. In the time of Jesus, Caesar Augustus would have been in control. Jesus would have been born during the time of, and we're reading through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it says in the time of Tiberius. And the Bible never mentions Caligula that I know of, but look how short a time he reigned. What? 4 years? And then Claudius, he would have been around the time of the early apostles, the early church. But then Nero would have been around the time more of Paul's ministry. And so Paul, when he is saying, I appeal to Caesar, he's saying, send me to Nero. A guy that today we remember as probably one of the worst, most vile, hedonistic, evil Roman empires of the day. And Paul was saying, I'd rather put my life in the hands of a guy like that than those wicked priests. What a thing to say. You know, it's just like, wow, really, Paul? So we go back to Acts chapter 26, or 25, and it says, but when Paul had appealed to be reserved under the hearing of Augustus, okay? Yes, Augustus was dead, the man. But the thing that Augustus set up as the new Roman emperor is his dynasty. So it's not wrong for the King James to say the hearing of Augustus, because that is the lineage or the dynasty of Augustus. I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Who's that? Nero. So he's basically saying, yeah, I'm going to send him to Nero and hear what happens. Well, then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. So King Agrippa says, you know, I'd kind of like to hear this guy, see what he has to say. And so he did. He calls him in. He wanted to hear Paul. So verse 23, and on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, at Festus's commandment, Paul was brought forth. Now, why was there such pomp? Well, because, remember, he's king. He's a King Agrippa. So when you have a king, well, you have to have pomp, and you have to have all these red carpets, and all these people coming around with all the flags and everything, and, you know, blowing the trumpets and all this stuff. So they do all that, and it calms down, and he says, now bring out this guy Paul. Now verse 24, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. Festus says, this is the guy Paul that all the Jews everywhere want dead. All right, King Agrippa, this is him. Now verse 25, but when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus. No, he didn't. He appealed to Nero. But that's all part of Augustus's dynasty. And often in the Bible we see that. Even in the Old Testament, there's a king Artaxerxes the first, on the second, and the third, and they're just referred to as Artaxerxes, even though they're the lineage. So there's nothing wrong with the Bible saying Augustus there. This is not an error in the King James Bible. And so he says, and look at the confession here in verse 25. The confession of Festus is, I don't find anything in this guy worthy of death. You know who that reminds me of? Pontius Pilate. When Jesus came before Pilate, he says, I find no fault in this man. He says, I don't see anything in him worthy of death. So Paul here is going through the same thing that Jesus did. Verse 26, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. So what is this guy Festus saying? He's saying, I've got to sit down and write a letter to Nero and say, Nero, this is a Roman citizen, and he asks you to pass judgment on what he's going through. And he's accused of picture Festus with a note trying to write this, and he's trying to go, well, how can I send a guy and I don't have what he's accused of? Because he says what they accused him of isn't what he thought, and it doesn't hold weight, and it's really, there's no crime that he's, look at verse 16, the crime laid against him. What is the crime laid against him? They still don't know. Except that the Jews don't like him, and he says things they don't like to hear. Well, whoop-de-doo, who deserves to die for saying something that somebody else doesn't like to hear? Unless we're living in communist China, or communist Russia, in which there's a thing called political correctness, and you're not allowed to say certain things with your mouth under penalty of death. Oh man, you know what's sad? That's sadly what America's becoming nowadays. In all these colleges, communists have taken over, and they're teaching the kids social justice, and say, you social justice warriors, why? Go out and attack people and tell them you're not allowed to say this, that, or the other thing, and if you say this or you say that, well, you're a bigot, sexist, racist, homophobic, blah, 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 and be violent about it, and kill people over their speech. But I thought we had freedom of speech. So don't ever let them take from you freedom of speech. That's a sad thing. And when someone ever says that you don't have a right to say something, and if you say that, then you ought to die, you are dealing with a person that probably has a demon. A person that's a hypocrite. That's what Jesus called the Pharisees. They're hypocrites. So he's sitting here going, I don't know. I have no idea what to write. Maybe you, King Agrippa, can help me figure out what the crime is that we can accuse this guy of so that we can send him to Caesar to be judged. So for verse 27 he says, for it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Yeah! That's like trying to go to the Supreme Court in the United States of America and say, I don't like this guy and I want you to kill him. And the Supreme Court says, what crime has he done? I don't know. He says things that I don't want to hear, so kill him already. That won't hold water. There are laws in the books. Now, if you've broken a law, yeah, but there was no law that Paul broke. All he did was say, Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He is God who died on the cross for your sins. And if you come to Him and you trust His blood, because He rose again from the dead, basically He's telling them the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. If you will trust in what Jesus did for you, you will have forgiveness of sins. So will you trust the death, burial, resurrection, and how Jesus Christ died for your sins? Will you trust the blood atonement? You're justified by faith, not by the law. What a horrible, horrible crime. You know what's sad? You ever heard of the Roman Catholic Church and the Inquisition? This whole thing plays out all over again 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later. The Roman Catholic Church is started, and the Roman Catholic Church goes around saying you're not justified by faith, you're not justified by faith. Why, anybody that says you're justified by faith, they're a liar. Only Holy Mother Church can justify you, and you have to go to Mass, and you have to have confession, and you have to be confirmed, you have to be baptized, and you got to do the works that we say, and anybody that says otherwise ought to die. And in the Roman Catholic Spanish Inquisition, the priests murdered, burned at the stake people who said, we don't believe what you teach, church. We believe we're only justified by faith. History is a circle. And history isn't a straight line that goes like this. It's like this. Boom, boom, boom. Turning over and over and over. Jesus was accused of something that He didn't do. And they accused false accusation against Jesus, and they killed Jesus Christ. Stephen just spoke up and said something that they didn't want to hear, and they stoned him to death, and they made false accusations against him. Peter comes along, they say put him in jail, they try to kill him. Paul comes along, they try to kill him. Anybody that stands up saying that the Bible says this, that, and the other thing, then the Roman Catholic Church tried to kill him. We're seeing a repeat. The old saying is, the only thing that men never learn from history is that men never learn from history. But let me tell you something. If you know history, you can see the direction that things are headed. And it's going to be the same thing happening over and over. Let me tell you what's going to happen in the United States of America. It's heading the way of socialism. Vladimir Lenin said the goal of socialism is communism. There are people in the United States of America that want America to become communist. Communism is a system of government in which they overthrow violently in a bloody revolution the government, and then take over and make slaves out of everybody. They did it in Russia in the early 1900s. They've done it around the world. Phil Pot in Cambodia, and China has done this, the Boxer Rebellion. And communism has killed over 100 million people in the last 100 years. Communism is the outright worst form of government you could ever have. Because in communism you have no rights, no freedom. No freedom of speech, no right to bear arms, no this, that. You are a slave. And in communism, the state is God. That's the way America is heading. The social justice warriors in America are not good people with good hearts that just trying to help people because they're trying to help people's civil rights. No, they are communists that want to kill people who are Christians. They want people to believe their way or die. So if the Lord tarries and people don't stand up against the evil communism preached in America, America will turn into a communist nation just like Venezuela. And people will be eaten out of dumpsters and eating dogs like they're doing in Venezuela. So don't let America become socialist or communist. It's a sad thing to see. And I'm not just saying that's my opinion. That's from over 100 years of history looking at what happens when a country becomes communist. And it never turns out good for the people. The best form of government is a moral government based upon moral laws. And many of the laws that we have in America are based upon the Bible. Many of the founding fathers were deists. They believe in God and the Bible, and they said, we must have a moral society to govern according to just laws. So we'll close with verse 27. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not without to signify the crimes laid against him. That's exactly right. Excellent. You can't judge someone until you charge them with a crime. And they still didn't have a crime to judge Paul with. This means Paul was left illegally in jail for 2 years. Because we began by the last chapter before this one where it says after 2 years. 2 years illegally in jail without being tried for a crime or anything. And we're seeing a repeat of that today. If the Lord doesn't come back soon, you're going to see the same thing you saw in Russia and the same thing you saw in Germany. The Stasi, the Schutzenstaffel, what do they call them? The secret police. They'll be coming to your house at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, breaking down the door, hauling you off to a concentration camp, and you'll never be heard of and seen again. Is that what you want? No. My hope is the Lord comes back soon, and I don't have to worry about that. But if He doesn't, be prepared. Be prepared for an evil, wicked government trying to take away your rights. History proves that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we see a repeat of the day and age of Paul. Rome, the corrupt Rome in power, keeping a guy in jail for 2 years who hasn't even done anything. Well, I hope this has been a blessing to you. Thank you for watching. There's your screenshot. We'll see you next time. God bless.